Hello, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to this episode of Beyond Max Q. I'm your host, Mollie Jahner. I am joined today by Myrthe Doedens. She's a principal strategist, but honestly, if I have to describe her, it would be brilliant storyteller. She finds the connections in some of the most opaque places, and she makes those connections, and then she can pull it front and center. And she does a tremendous job of that. She's also got this tremendous career where she's worked in a bunch of different places: tech, government, the military. And so, with that, I'm very excited to interview you today. Please introduce yourself and tell us what you have going on.
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you for having me. As you mentioned, my name is Myrthe Doedens. I have been in the DC world for about a little over a decade now, but I have a very I call it kind of a ping pong path through life and my career. I started my work in the intelligence community, working on counterterrorism, and then shifted to national security, tech, and consulting, and have pulled the communications and storytelling thread through that. So, started on why people do terrible things that they do based on what they see online or in networks they're associated with, and taking that element of communications and what drives people to action from that fairly intense world now to slightly lower stakes, I would argue, but still very important world of how to get businesses and teams into a spot that translate to success for them based on how they communicate both internally and externally. So yeah, been in that space for a while. Also, by way of background, grew up in a European household, Dutch specifically, and have lived in a couple of different states with very different cultural environments across the U.S. So all of that put together, I think, really lends itself to kind of what you mentioned, that storytelling aspect and being able to see things from multiple perspectives and figure out what the best path forward is.
Yeah, and that's hard, I think. And it's so our audience is mainly founders. We're thinking about creating something new, creating from scratch, and maybe I know what it is, I have it in my mind. But then it's like, how do you communicate that? What would you say to somebody who's just getting started and they're passionate about what they're building, but maybe they don't know how to communicate it to the outside world?
I think the deceivingly simple thing would be to talk to other people about it, which I completely understand is scary and hard when it's your idea and you own it and maybe it's not entirely fleshed out yet and it's a little nerve-wracking to go talking to people about it. But the biggest kind of downfall I think I see, especially in the startup world early on, is that a founder or I'd say maybe just an ideator that's trying to move things forward, they know it so well because it's lodged inside of their brains,
Hmm.
but they aren't the customer, right? Or they aren't the end goal of the company. So I think it's imperative that you do run your idea by a couple of different people at least, even if it's a close circle. You don't have to put it out there on the internet for everybody to judge and criticize, but make sure you have those people around you that do take a red pen to your ideas, and do so in a way that thinks through customer groups, audiences, what your ideal goals are, right? You can have a really cool idea, but what's the impact of that idea? What does success look like beyond just numbers on an Excel spreadsheet or or on your bank balance? Things like that I think are really hard to nail down yourself, not because somebody's not good enough or you don't know what you're doing, but just you need that outside perspective and people to poke holes in what it is that you're trying to accomplish. So yeah, I think I've seen that not be taken as step one before. And whether it's step one or step 10, I still think you're going to have to do it. And I think it pays dividends to do that upfront and be able to take in those suggestions and that feedback before you potentially launch down a path of spending a lot of money, time, what have you, developing something that might not actually be hitting the important notes when it comes to resonating with your audience.
Right. Well, and I love how you said taking that feedback too. So, what does that look like? Is it all the feedback or is it just like, how do you know it's good feedback? Because I think that there's also, as a founder, there's a lot of people who want to tell you, I mean, for marketing, you're in marketing, I'm in marketing. It's part of everybody's a marketer. Look, I made a meme and it's like, oh, but
Yeah.
is that helping? So how do you know if the feedback is good feedback?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think unfortunately that is where it's more of an art than a science, right? Anything in the communication space, depending, just like I say, I have a lot of perspectives and I come at something with a certain viewpoint. You have yours, another person has their own. And I think to assume that there is a silver bullet or there's a perfect line of text or a perfect meme or a perfect a bit of collateral that's going to hit everything, I think that's just a really big misnomer. I think maybe if you're a juggernaut of a company with a built-in client base already, you can get away with that because you're going to hit a certain percentage regardless. But if you're a smaller company, you really can't just assume that you do one thing and then have that kind of launch everything else. Um, I do think that as a founder or as again kind of this idea owner, if you're able to already take that step and gather feedback, my guess is you probably have a bit of that gut check built in that'll be helpful to you. I find that the people that don't want to seek feedback, and when I say that, I don't mean people are just throwing unsolicited advice at you because that's not very helpful. But if you as an individual don't feel comfortable going to others with your idea, I would say that you might not have it fleshed out enough yet to be able to understand what feedback you should take and what
Yeah.
feedback you shouldn't. And I know that that's not really the most helpful answer,
No,
but
it's good.
I think it's a combination of gut reaction and confidence, which nobody can really teach that. I think that's just born out of somebody's background and the idea you have and the passion you have behind it. But then also the humility and the critical thought to seek out that healthy criticism from others and that feedback. That combination is probably the sweet spot. And I don't think anybody has that down perfect all of the time. I think we all have an element of defensive reaction in us when people come at us with certain feedback. But again, just the ability to think through that and to not apply that reaction to anything, frankly, anything business related, but especially in the communication space to be able to check yourself and go, is this actually how I want to be communicating to others? Is this how I want my brand to be presented? Is this the path I want to go down? I just think it's that healthy balance, but I would say having a stable of critical voices around you is important, and I wanna be clear that that doesn't have to be, like, successful founders of Fortune 50 companies that you're calling up and that can tell you everything that they did to become millionaires, like, that's I mean, that fantastic, use that, but I think it could also just be somebody who knows you really well, who you went to grad school with, and then maybe somebody you met at a networking opportunity, and then maybe a former client or it doesn't they
Mhm.
don't all have to be like superheroes in their own fields. It's just about getting different perspectives from people who all take in information differently and piecing all of that together combined with your own gut to really be able to move things forward.
I love that. Oh, I like how you said superheroes in their field. I also I feel like we have such an opportunity to talk to you. Probably should have scheduled a longer podcast, but you also focus a lot on the PR side and the communications, and I think that that's a really interesting perspective as a founder, right? Because I think it's if people don't know about you, then you can't do business. And so
Mhm.
I would love to hear your thoughts on like, okay, you're getting started, maybe you've gone through a raise, you have some dollars. Where do you invest? Where do you start with PR? What does a plan look like?
Yeah, this actually is a very relevant question because I was having one of these conversations last week with a company in the that dual use tech space. Um, I don't think there's a perfect playbook for this, right? Because ideally, if you've raised some capital, you have an element of brand built out, right? So, especially in that dual use tech space, but potentially also in other markets, some companies benefit from being a little bit more under the radar and not as blatant in their marketing or slapping their logo on a bunch of events, right? Or anything to that degree. Some other companies, that is the path they want to go down because the high visibility is the thing that's going to speak the most to their potential customer groups. So I would say if you haven't done that branding work, that's where you should put your money and time first. Because if you can't clearly articulate to other people, again, there comes in the point of having to harness other people to do marketing. It's very hard to do that all as a one person show. Um, Especially if you're trying to do it on a large scale. So if you don't have a brand locked down yet, there are so many people out there that are fantastic at developing that. And that's everything from, yeah, your logos, your colors, your fonts, but also Who are you? What are you trying to evoke in a customer? What platforms make the most sense? I see a lot of people worried that they have to spend money on the X, the Instagram, the LinkedIn, the Threads, the Blue Sky, everything out there. And I think most marketers would agree that that isn't always the best use of your cash, that there's probably better targeted ways that you could advertise or at least communicate with your customer group. So yeah, first off, that brand book, the brand guide piece, part of that often, if not a subsequent part, is really doing a deep dive in who your clients are or who your potential customers could be, because that's also your audience for marketing. So a lot of these elements, I think, yes, you could think of them as sheerly marketing dollars, but frankly, they're also sales dollars, because if you don't know who your ideal client or customer or audience group is, then how are you going to effectively sell to them? How are you going to onboard
Hmm.
sales teams to then go sell to them? Because again, those sales teams are not in your brain as a founder. They haven't lived the entire ideation of this thing, this company. Um, so making sure you're able to articulate that, and it may shift from day one to, day 25 or year 3 or whatever it is. But spending that time up front, oftentimes that involves bringing in an outside party to help. Again, they kind of poke holes in your thinking, kind of
Right.
trying to drive you to dig a little deeper on what you're trying to achieve. Um, and then truly that last piece I would say is spending time, money, same one and the same. I think um, allowing yourself to test out
Mm.
certain messages. Again, this is tied to sales, this is tied to brand identity and everything, but the idea that you have to kind of pick a slogan, right? Or pick a visual or pick a commercial
Yes.
and go with that and that be the only thing. One, it's incredibly high risk because you're putting all your eggs in one basket, which
Right.
I think in any other scenario in business you probably wouldn't do. It's tempting because it's marketing dollars and people like just kind of plonking marketing dollars
They
down
do.
on very specific campaigns. But allow yourself, even if it means having to splice your money to do two smaller things,
Hmm.
start testing out those messages, the A/B testing element. They talk about it a lot on social media marketing, but it applies to everything. It applies in a meeting, right?
Hmm.
If you're trying out one message in one meeting, one message in another, see which one works best. So again, the brand, which feeds into figuring out who your customer groups are, who your audiences are, and then being able to allow yourself to be flexible and test out some of these messages. And as far as I'm concerned, marketing should be in on day zero, really, because it's aligned to your sales, it's aligned to your growth, it's aligned to everything.
Hmm.
Um, and that, yeah, I think the best startups, the best even just the best efforts, the best campaigns inside of existing companies, they align from the beginning rather than developing this whole entire sales idea and strategy and then coming at marketing and say, okay, now go do, because that's not setting yourself up for a ton of success, I think.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I honestly love the idea of building a revenue engine. It's not just marketing as a standalone, it's not just sales as a standalone. It's like, how are we doing this thing together? Because so often I feel like they are broken pieces
Mhm.
because they're not connected. And so I feel like that story, that brand unites them, right? Are we all saying the same thing? Are we all, communicating the same message? Because otherwise the customer's going to get confused and then not going to purchase, right? So it's like kind of that piece, that bridge is really important. I love what you said there. Well, you have worked with so many different startups over your career. I would love for you to just call out what makes the successful ones successful, and what do they have that maybe the ones that aren't succeeding, what do they have? What's special?
I mean, the easy one is obviously capital, but that's unfair to answer, right? You have money, it helps.
Yeah.
I think everybody would agree with that. No, but I think even I've worked with some that frankly have either personal capital from the get-go, and even those, I think if as team or a founder, whatever kind of that initial group of folks, group of brains is that's trying to
Mhm.
get something off the ground, the more insular they are, in my experience, the harder time they're going to have moving their idea forward. It may be really successful in the beginning, right? Because especially if you have that personal capital, but even without that, if it's If you're an insular group or you're extremely smart or you're extremely talented, right, you can do a lot of things, but at a certain point, you have to add other people into that to scale. I mean, you could argue now that you can do a lot with AI and you can minimize the amount of people that you need to bring in, but I would still very heavily argue that you need that tech to human teaming aspect, especially in a startup, because it is messy, because it's a gray space. You don't want to assume that tech can fix problems you might not even know exist yet in your systems or in your company. Um, but yeah, the more insular you stay, the harder it is to bring on the sales teams, to bring on the administrative teams, to bring on the finance folks, whatever it may be, even interns that you're hoping can help you with some more basic, logistical information and tasks on a day to day. If they can't easily access or understand the information regarding what it is everybody's doing, then you very quickly, I think, reach a ceiling on how much you can grow. So I think that would probably be the number one limiting factor, in my opinion. And I think especially if you're an outside contractor or you're somebody coming in to help those teams, personally, I think you can tell that pretty quickly if you're on an introductory call or something like that. If there's a hesitance to share information or you feel like you're not getting a clear idea of what gaps you would be filling as that contractor, that'd be kind of my piece of advice to 1099s out there is if you feel like there's an opacity to that,
Mm.
you're probably dealing with a slightly more insular group of founders. And again, I want to make clear that's not an inherently negative thing. I think it's just an approach to building a business that some folks try to keep their stable very small
Mm.
and others are more open from the beginning. Um, as far as what makes a startup successful, again, I'm not a finance buff. I don't have those chops underneath me, but I think the ability and the comfort to do things wrong every once in a while. And again, saying that from my lens, so I wouldn't say that obviously for legal and financial purposes, getting things wrong is not great.
Disclaimer, yeah.
Yes, but on the creative side, on the sales process, marketing, comms, strategy even of how you're going into a new market, being able to recognize that you are going to make mistakes.
Hmm.
Most of the time, it's not going to be the end of the world, especially, again, if you're able to open yourself up to multiple perspectives, you can consider many of the pitfalls ahead of time, or at least be ready for them when they come. Um, So just being cognizant of and being able to accept the fact that you may run into a couple walls here or there. And when you do, not turning around to the rest of your team or comms or sales again, whatever those other parts of your team are, and saying, we failed, this was terrible, but instead turning around and asking, all right, that didn't work, right? For whatever reason. And it might be stressful. It might put strain on what's happening, but that doesn't mean that there's nothing to learn from it.
Hmm.
And I think a prime example of those moments are, especially in the DC space, we have a lot of the giant conventions and events that are pricey to be at as a company, as a group. Having one of those booths or any amount of presence there, even if it's just sending a couple of your team members, you could be at a couple thousand very quickly. Um, and then oftentimes I have heard folks go, well, we didn't sign a bunch of deals out of that. So why did we do that? Okay, that's fair. I understand that people have expectations, but how did you interface with the people that were there? What was an audience's reaction to your marketing, to your message, to your presence? There's so much you can learn just from being there that if you're only measuring things by black and white, we did not sell, ergo we failed,
Yeah.
you're missing out on so many of the nuances that the earlier you gather them, the more impactful they can be later on, in my opinion. Um,
No, that's
and
well said.
yeah.
Well, I would add too, for those that are going to events like that, your startup, you can't afford it. Have a list. Who's going? Who else is attending that event? And then reach out to them and try and schedule meetings like
Mhm.
ancillary to whatever's happening at the event. I think that's going to be your best way to do business. And then if you have a booth or if you're there and that's a captive audience. Go talk to the businesses that are there because they're on the floor. So they're not going anywhere. Go chat with them, make connections. And I think if you're willing to do that, you can actually do a lot for free or for very inexpensive. You're building those relationships or, hey, let's go grab a coffee after this or whatever that looks like. So
Yeah,
good point. I mean,
research. Yeah, research who's going to be there. I think I've been lucky in my career to have a few leadership teams that were very big on researching who was going to be there before you got there, so that not to be creepy and weird about it, but just to know, hey, if I see so and so,
Oh, that's your picture. That's you. Don't do
yeah,
that.
not to catch people off guard. There's an art to it, right? But to say, okay, I know that person's there. I know they're in a funding round. I know they're interested in XYZ. So I can go there and instead of making small talk for 15 minutes, I can introduce myself and say, hey, I actually took the time and I know you're looking for XYZ. I think I may be able to meet that, or I think I have an idea for you. That does so much more than just going, hi, I know you come from a company with money, and let's get coffee, right? There's an element of work ahead of time that most people I think do, but I also think it's very underrated and that it needs to be continually brought to the forefront, not just when you're an intern, young, down in the ranks doing the grit work of pulling all this information together, but I think also as somebody representing either yourself or a company or a client, everybody's time matters, right? So making the
Yes.
most out of the time you have on that floor or in that event.
No, that's, yeah, really well said. I feel like I would like to have another episode with you where we continue to talk through some of these things, but I know for the sake of time, keeping them short, is there anything you want to add that we haven't already covered for our founders or for those listening?
I really think, again, coming back to it sounds so simple, but think about who you have in your network, and that can be personal, it can be work related, but reach out to people, get their perspective on what it is you're doing. Almost everybody is thrilled to be asked for their perspective. In my experience, there's very few people that off the bat just say, nope, don't want to talk, don't want to look at it, because we're humans. We like sharing our opinions. We like kind of figuring out what we think about things, right? So ask, be okay if people say no, but ask and then gather that feedback. And if you don't use it, that's also okay, but just log it somewhere, have it somewhere, right? Because if a couple of years down the road, that same feedback circles back around, then
Yeah.
you can kind of think, okay, maybe that had some merit to it, or why is that? And um, I think the most low barrier to entry is just asking folks for that opinion and being ready to accept it, or at least
Have a
think through it
conversation.
critically.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, have a conversation. And I think that's when the era of LinkedIn, of social media, of other platforms really comes in handy, because you don't need to have a super long standing personal relationship with somebody to recognize that they have a skill set and that their perspective might be useful to you. So just don't be shy to do that. And I think for the most part, especially for those of us that are in the marketing space or in the comp space, we're always excited to read or see something new or figure out what's out there. So yeah, the network is there, and don't be shy about it.
I love it. Well, and what are you currently reading is always my last question.
What am I currently reading? Oh man, I am reading The Nightingale, I'm a
Oh,
sucker
I've
for
wanted to
World
read
War
that.
II. Yeah, I know it's coming out or came out as a movie. I'm still keeping my blinders on for that because I need to finish the book, but I'm always a sucker for World War II related, whether it's nonfiction or fiction. Definitely inherited that from my dad, who's always got a giant Winston Churchill book somewhere that he's reading through. But yeah, that's what I'm working through currently.
I love it. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for your time. If you guys want to connect with Myrta, please do. I know I've known her now for almost 3 or 4 years. She is just tremendous in every way, truly a beautiful human being as well. And so please reach out to her and connect. And I'll put links in the chat or in the video description. And thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Likewise.